What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review Black Phone 2, the sequel to the smash hit from 2021, and they've gotten the entire band back together. We have director Scott Derrickson, also co-writing once again with C. Robert Cargill, and we have Ethan Hawke back as the Grabber.
Hello, Finney.
And I'll go 100% spoiler-free initially, but toward the end of the video, there are one or two points that I can't make without going into some spoiler-light territory, but I'll give you a verbal warning as well as a time code below before I do so. But for those of you who prefer to skip ahead to the good part of a review, let me go ahead and get this out of the way. I think Black Phone 2 is a perfectly adequate sequel to the first Black Phone, a movie which I did enjoy. This new one's probably 50% of a good horror movie, and then unfortunately in the second half of the movie, due to some really clumsy exposition sequences, as well as some really lame action sequences, the movie just kind of falls apart at the seams. However, 50% of a good horror movie is nothing to sneeze at, and Blumhouse, which has been on a serious cold streak over the last couple of years, I think this is the best movie by Blumhouse I've seen in a couple of years. And I enjoy making fun of Blumhouse almost as much as I enjoy making fun of Disney, just because the track records speak for themselves. Over the last few years, Blumhouse has made a lot of terrible horror movies, almost as bad as some of the science fiction and superhero movies that Disney has made over in their corner of Hollywood. But I don't need a horror movie to be a 100% success to enjoy the horror movie on some level, and I was definitely invested in a lot of this movie. I think Ethan Hawke was really selling it for me. Ethan Hawke seems to be leaning into the character of the Grabber with as much relish and fun and delight as Robert Englund used to with Freddy Krueger back in the day. And with this sequel, you can definitely tell that they are, at least the two screenwriters, Scott Derrickson and Robert Cargill, they're increasingly taking a lot of inspiration from the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And that's fine. Like Nightmare on Elm Street, I think they got like 6 or 7 movies out of that character, plus a reboot later on down the road. And also, speaking of Robert Cargill, it's funny, I always forget, I first became aware of him as a critic over on Ain't It Cool back in the early 2000s, back when he was going by the name Massaworm. And I met him briefly at Button-Omathon back in 2013. I was like, Massaworm! He's like, I don't go by that name anymore. But he and Scott Derrickson clearly enjoy working together. And I think the best thing that ever happened to Scott Derrickson, maybe not to his bank account, but definitely for his creative impulses, was splitting away from Marvel. He directed Doctor Strange, and for reasons that I cannot recall, it's been a while since I've had to dig up those old memories, there was a split, there was a schism at some point where he and Marvel had a parting in the ways, and he kind of retreated back to the horror genre. But I think Scott Derrickson is much more at home within the horror genre. I mean, if you just look at his career overall, hang on, let me have just a quick glance. So we got The Gorge, which came out earlier this year on Apple. I'd totally forgotten that he had directed The Gorge. I actually enjoyed The Gorge. I know a lot of people made fun of The Gorge, but I thought The Gorge had some nice ingredients. But as far as his horror movies go, obviously he did The Black Phone in 2021, but he also did Deliver Us from Evil in 2014, Sinister in 2012, and The Exorcism of Emily Rose back in 2005. But getting back to Black Phone 2, here's the official premise as written over on IMDb. As Finn, now 17, struggles with life after his captivity, his sister begins receiving calls in her dreams from the Black Phone and seeing disturbing visions of 3 boys being stalked in a winter camp known as Alpine Lake. And without giving away too much from the story, I'll say that there's a lot of backstory involving their family tree, as well as the character known as the Grabber, played by Ethan Hawke. And so it just allows you to have a deeper dive into these characters that we're already familiar with from the first movie. And for me, the most interesting parts of the movie and the scariest parts of the movie were the dream sequences experienced by Gwen, where the movie takes on this kind of hardcore late 70s, early 80s, 35 millimeter aesthetic, where it almost like it takes the grain up to a level where you're like, wait a second, I lived at that time. Movies weren't that grainy at that time, but they're leaning into it with like the audio popping and all that stuff. Anytime you saw a film print that had a little age on it and you get all that audio crackle, there's a definite like a tactile aesthetic to watching kind of a beat up 35 millimeter film print. I thought it was an interesting choice that they would lean into that, because this movie takes place in 1982, a few years after the original movie. And as Gwen and her brother Finn start to investigate this mystery up at Alpine Lake, there's some legitimately creepy sequences that lean all the way into some of the best aspects of supernatural horror, especially if you like ghost stories. I think these are some of the most effective ghosts that I've seen on screen in quite some time, where clearly some very, very horrible things have happened to the kids up at this camp. Because in the world of horror, every camp is just full of murder and mayhem and all sorts of childhood trauma and that sort of thing. But the way that Scott Derrickson unveils some of these spirits and some of the things that might have happened to them, I was like, all right, like, bravo, Mr. Derrickson. Your skills as a horror director are still absolutely intact. And as far as Ethan Hawke goes as the Grabber, early on in the movie at least, they use him in very small doses, which make his appearances all the more effective and all the more chilling. And you can just tell Ethan Hawke is just like smiling from ear to ear. He doesn't even need to put that mask on. You can just tell he's having the time of his life playing this character and just leaning all the way into it. Perhaps in the latter part of the movie, he has a little bit too much fun, or maybe he got some poor direction. But I think the fatal flaw of this movie, or not the fatal flaw, one of the kind of the crippling flaws, which reduces the movie's overall impact, is that the movie increasingly becomes a little bit. You know what? I mentioned earlier Nightmare on Elm Street, that franchise. That franchise, as it progressed, got increasingly silly and more bizarre. Like basically after Dream Warriors, it just kind of leaned all into like full-blown camp. And this movie at a certain point decides basically just to like give people powers within the realm of dreams, and it basically starts to take on, it basically becomes a very different kind of movie, and it kind of forgets all the chills and thrills and the suspense that characterized the entirety of the first movie and the first half of the second movie. And I'm sorry, if I'm paying money to go see a horror movie, I expect the horror movie to have the courage of its convictions and try to stick the landing and not restore the status quo, not send everybody home safe and sound. Like, I want to have like my soul ripped out of my body, and I want to have like my bones and my corpse pissed on by the filmmaker. I want them to traumatize me. I want them to completely freak me out. And Black Phone 2 does not go there. The first half was, it got under my skin, but then it kind of takes its foot off the gas pedal, and I think ultimately Black Phone 2 will be a disappointment for people who consider themselves to be hardcore horror fans. And this movie is guilty of a few mistakes that a lot of horror movies are guilty of, where they dispel the atmosphere of horror entirely. Like rule number 1, don't turn on the lights and fill a room full of people and have them discuss the plot. That's not scary. It lets the audience kind of exhale and relax and forget to, rub their palms together and forget all their fear and anxiety. And there's a long, ridiculous exposition sequence in the middle of this movie where suddenly it's like, who are all these characters? Why are they here? Why are they even in the movie? All they're doing is dispelling the atmosphere of horror as opposed to intensifying it. You don't need but so many characters in a horror movie in order to sustain the mood of horror. And then they have a kind of a repeat or like a second go around of that scene later on, which once again dispelled the overall atmosphere of horror. And also the character of Gwen, as she discovers her abilities within the kind of the dreamscape, she becomes increasingly insufferable. Like Finney as a hero in the first movie was very easy to get behind, because who can't relate to a teenager trapped in a basement where he knows he's going to be just chopped to pieces like before too long. And Gwen starts kind of lecturing her brother and lecturing her father and lecturing everybody around her. I was like, oh, this is turning into quite a different movie, and I don't like any of it. And Jeremy Davies, who I usually like, he does the best with the material that is given to him, although that material's, I would say, subpar. Damian Bashir is actually pretty good as Mondo in this, or at least he's pretty good early on. And once again, the movie's leaning into horror as opposed to action and spectacle. And I just feel like anytime you are ostensibly making a horror movie or an extension of a horror franchise, you got to remember what franchise you are making, unless you're just going to lean all the way into just full-blown stylized campiness, which can work under certain circumstances if it becomes hilarious or if the action's completely, totally over the top. Like both the Friday the 13th franchise as well as Nightmare on Elm Street became increasingly strange as they progressed. But I was a stupid kid. I was there for all of it. It never really bothered me. But now that I'm a mean, cynical kind of asshole adult, yeah, if a movie starts to betray its original style, its original premise, its original atmosphere, well, then I'm definitely going to sit up and take notice. But I'll say this, in the absence of legit horror in the second half of this movie, my audience, they were on such poor behavior during my screening, you could almost say that they were more than making up for the absence of horror in the movie. I haven't had a bad experience like this in quite some time, because I've been avoiding the Regal at Union Square here in New York. I mean, it's the closest theater to me, so it's always very tempting to go. And I saw today there's a screening at 2 o'clock. I was like, I know it's maybe because it's early, all the maniacs won't be there, but there's something about that theater due to its proximity of Union Square and all the subway lines going through there. If there's a crazy motherfucker in the city of New York who wants to see a movie, they go to this Regal Union Square. And I stopped going years ago because, or at least actually, I think the last time I saw a movie there was like January of this year, when I saw that stupid Wolfman movie, yet another Blumhouse movie. Can't even remember what that movie was called. The movie about generational trauma. In any event, terrible horror movie. But I'd sworn off going to the theater because I've had so many bad experiences with people talking, being on their phones, just creating chaos. And today during the screening, there was one person who was just like just snoring up a storm, just bored out of their minds. It's like, oh, that's harmless. They can't help it that they're bored. They fell asleep. There's some other people where they're just like, they had texts coming in left and right, and they kept like the phone kept offering like verbal alerts, like they were almost like calling for help. Anyway, I was screaming at these people, getting into a heightened state of agitation. I was like turn off your fucking phone and blah, blah, blah. And I think because I was in such a heightened state of agitation that I was actually helping some of the earlier effects in the movie get under my skin and make it more traumatizing. There's something about when you're already kind of like angry and agitated, for me at least, it was actually helping with the movie-going experience. But then as the movie started to become less scary, I just became increasingly annoyed by the terrible behavior. And there are also just people just like muttering and jabbering, like when just like, talking a mile a minute to themselves, just like, la, 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 la. I was like, why did I come to this theater? I've learned my lesson many times over, but once again, just due to the start time and the proximity to my home, I couldn't resist. I am finished with the Regal at Union Square for all time. Even if they were to pay me to see movies at their theater from now on, I will never go back there again. I go to the AMC Lincoln Square up at 68th and Broadway because they have that killer IMAX screen, one of the best in the country. Or I go to the Alamo Drafthouse down in Lower Manhattan, where if you're causing a disturbance, they will kick you out. No refund, and I love it. On your phone, doesn't matter. Like, you have an emergency, doesn't matter. If you're causing a disturbance in the movie, you're gone. But because I verbally lashed out at the people a few times, and because I was horribly outnumbered by all the maniacs in the theater, there was a part of me that started thinking, what if one of these maniacs is like a full-blown, like, actual maniac and decides to sneak up behind me during the movie and, like, throttle me or stab me or whatever? And because I was nervous about perhaps I'd overplayed my hand a little bit, that actually was like helping to make the movie more frightening and more terrifying. And what it reminded me of many years ago when I was in college, when Halloween H2O came out, which I think was Halloween 7, but it was a big kind of like rebrand of Halloween in the spirit of Scream after Halloween had kind of gone away for a couple of years. But I went to a theater and I was there by myself, high as balls. And at one point, just for whatever reason in that theater, I think that was like 1997, I just happened to turn around like during the movie because I was nervous. And I thought I saw a person sitting in the back row by themselves. And I was like, ooh, they weren't there when I first got here. That's kind of weird. And so while I was watching Halloween H2O, the entire second half of the movie, I was terrified that I was sharing the theater with a full-blown lunatic who was going to like cut my throat. And then at the end of the movie, when the lights came on, I looked back there again, what I'd been seeing was a trash can that was sticking up behind the back row. But in a weird way, I was thankful because even though I'd fooled myself into thinking that someone was about to kill me, I did have a very positive, or at least a very intense first experience with Halloween H2O. And I haven't watched that movie in a long time. I don't know how well it's aged. But, when you're watching a horror movie, strange outside factors can have a massive impact on your overall enjoyment or lack thereof. And speaking of that lack thereof, let me offer one spoiler-like comment about Black Phone 2 and why I found the ending to be so unsatisfying. And once again, if you want to go in totally spoiler-free, I get it. Like, bail out now. But I will have one or two final comments to make about just Blumhouse in general toward the end of the video. But the climax of this movie is basically a battle on the ice. They're trying to dig up the bones of these dead children because they realize if they dig up the bones of these dead children, it will like take away the power of the grabber and the afterlife to basically have an impact on the outside world. But the movie makes this critical mistake where it turns into a full-blown like Avengers Assemble action movie where you have like 9 heroes on the ice battling the grabber who is on ice skates. Once again, the Freddy Krueger comparisons are very apt in this case where it starts to become fucking silly. But there's also a problem where like the logic of this movie and what's within a dream and what's not in a dream, it's very inconsistent where suddenly people who are awake are fighting basically like the Invisible Man fighting the grabber while he is still kind of in the realm of the afterlife or dreams. It didn't work for me at all. But once again, if a horror movie becomes action-driven and like combat-driven, then like all ability to cause fear and anxiety just gets completely eroded. Like look at a movie like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Right up to the bitter end. No matter how many chainsaws are wielded or people are impaled on hooks or whatever, it never turns into an action movie. Even when it turns into basically a chase movie, it's still like a movie where the characters are wide-eyed with terror. And in this movie, the characters are like you're in trouble now, grabber. Like, don't fuck with me, blah, blah, blah. It's like the characters should never feel self-confident. The characters should never feel like they're suddenly Jean Grey with like telepathy and telekinesis where like, the grabber's in trouble now. It was super lame, super pathetic. And I just found myself actively turning against the movie. Perhaps I wouldn't have turned against it quite so aggressively if I wasn't already so annoyed by all the fucking lunatics in my goddamn theater today. but turn against the movie I did, and so that's why I can only make a half-hearted, kind of half-throated recommendation for this movie. If you love the first Black Phone, it's not as good as the first Black Phone. But if you really love it and you want to see new franchises continue to emerge and you want to support Blumhouse and you want to support the fact that this actually is a brand new movie franchise in the 2020s, that's a rare thing, and I don't take that lightly. Although, to be fair, Joe Hill's original short story upon which the first movie was based, that goes back to 2004. But in the 2020s, there's been an alarming lack of new franchises that have no previous iteration in the 20-teens or the aughts or whatever. And I'm always like, hoping for and craving new franchises. And as I often say, if you're looking for new storytelling experiences or originality or fresh new voices when it comes to filmmakers, more often than not, you're going to find it within the horror genre, at least in the 2020s. Very rarely are you going to find that in sci-fi. Very rarely are you going to find that in the world of superheroes. But in horror, because the budgets are small, people can actually take risks and they can actually take a chance on new IP. And that first Black Phone, just to remind folks, it was made on a budget of approximately 16 to 18 million. And it grossed 161 million at the worldwide box office. Like that's why we have Black Phone 2. I don't think they necessarily had like a great story to tell, but like, god damn, we made so much fucking money with that first one. We got to make a sequel. Whether or not this movie will do well enough to generate a Black Phone 3, who knows? I feel like Ethan Hawke could play this character for the rest of his life if he wished to. And it's October right now, and people are obviously in the mood for spooky movies. I just don't know if this is going to be the home run Halloween success that pretty much every year seems to generate. Like every year around this time, a couple of horror movies come out, whether it's Terrifier 3 or whatever, and usually there's one that really breaks out while the others kind of fall to the wayside. I don't know if Black Phone 2 is going to be that home run that Blumhouse is looking for. But like I said, even though I love talking shit about Blumhouse and their bland brand of horror that they've leaned into over the last couple of years, where it's like they make horror movies for people who don't ever want to be too scared or too disturbed. And for me, I just feel like when I go see a horror movie from any era, I want to be disturbed as much as humanly possible. Whether you're talking about a movie like Todd Browning's Freaks from the early 30s, which remains an incredibly disturbing movie nearly 100 years later, or a movie like Terrifier 3, where I wasn't disturbed, but I was definitely stimulated and entertained. But I like my horror movies to be high octane, I like them to be strong drink. I want an intense, visceral experience that'll leave me talking about it for a very long time. I have a feeling I will have forgotten about most of Black Phone 2 by this time tomorrow, apart from the fact that the Regal at Union Square is to be avoided like the bubonic plague until the end of time. But all hope is not lost if you're a horror fan. I saw a cool trailer for a movie called Dream Eater before Black Phone 2 that definitely got my interest. And tonight, I'm seeing Guillermo del Toro's new adaptation of Frankenstein, which I'll be reviewing tomorrow morning. And Osgood Perkins has a movie called Keeper coming out in a couple weeks. And my current favorite active director working within the horror genre, Damian McCarthy, he has a horror film called Hokum, which is in post-production right now. The release date's not until next year, but his previous two features were Oddity and Caveat. And his style of horror is not for everybody, but if you enjoy slow build horror movies where it's a little bit like you're the frog in a pot, where like it doesn't know that the water's starting to boil until it's much too late, Caveat and Oddity function much the same way, where you're sitting down and you're watching the movie and you're like, what is everybody talking about? Like, why is everybody saying like these movies are so scary? But they kind of slowly but surely wrap their fingers around your throat and suddenly realize like you've run out of air, but he's doing it so gradually that he's kind of managed to sneak up on you. He doesn't do jump scares or any of that kind of crap. Or if he does a jump scare, it's a really worthwhile one. So I feel like horror remains an incredibly exciting genre right now. And at a time where pretty much every other genre of storytelling out there, or every other franchise out there is boring me to death, horror keeps me coming back to the theater. And I would happily see a horror movie every weekend if there were good ones to go see. But fingers crossed that some of these movies like Keeper and Hokum will deliver in the months and years to come. But I think that's all I've got to say about Black Phone 2. If you really, really, really love the first one and you're dying to see the second one, then absolutely go to the theater, throw it on your cash and check it out. But if you're looking for great horror experiences, you can definitely find them elsewhere. But speaking of horror, coming up on Monday the 27th, I'm going to be recording a big horror movie trivia apocalypse video with a couple other contestants, where it's going to be like a 3-hour trivia contest where I'm going to be showing clips and all kinds of stuff. Stay tuned for that. I'll probably end up posting that on October 28th. But that's going to be my big horror celebration for Halloween this year. I'm very excited about that. But if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, hitting that notification bell to make sure that you get all future videos. I would greatly appreciate it. But I hope everybody has a great weekend at the movies, and I will see y'all tomorrow when I review GDT's Frankenstein. But thanks again for watching. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.